A
It
blind
gets a little
retired Navy
loud in
SEAL
this
walked into a
section.
canine
Just
recovery
stay
center,
close, we're
hoping to
almost
find
through.
one quiet companion for his lonely life. But behind a locked steel door waited Ranger, a retired military canine no one dared to touch. They called the dog dangerous, broken, and impossible to save. Then the old soldier's cane tapped across the floor, and the dog suddenly stopped growling. What Ranger remembered that day would uncover a buried military secret, a missing mother, and one final promise from the dead.
Stay with me, we're
This is a
getting you
story
help right
about
now.
grief, loyalty, faith, and the miracle that happens when two wounded souls find each other.
Are you injured?
Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, leave your thoughts, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep writing more powerful stories. The first thing anyone heard was not his voice, but the cane. One slow tap against the polished concrete floor, then another, then the soft drag of old leather boots carrying a tired man through the front entrance of Cedar Ridge Canine Recovery Center. Outside, snow moved across the parking lot in thin white sheets, brushing against the windows like restless fingers. Inside, the building smelled of disinfectant, damp fur, stainless steel bowls, and winter coats drying near the heater. Dogs barked somewhere beyond the lobby, some sharp with excitement, some low with suspicion, some small and lonely enough to sound almost human. The receptionist looked up first, then a young volunteer near the supply shelf, then the woman standing behind the adoption counter. The old man in the doorway did not turn toward any of them. He simply stood still, listening to the room as though sight had been replaced by something quieter and more careful. His name was Walter Harlan. He was 70 years old, a retired Navy SEAL, and blind. He was tall once, the kind of tall that made younger men straighten without knowing why, but age had thinned him and bent his shoulders slightly. Still, there was discipline in the way he held himself. His face was narrow and weathered, carved with deep lines around his mouth and forehead, his jaw still square beneath a rough silver beard trimmed unevenly by hands that no longer trusted mirrors. His hair was white, cut short in the old military style, and his pale, clouded eyes stared slightly past the world. In his right hand, he held a dark wooden cane, polished smooth by years of use. He wore an old olive military coat, a charcoal turtleneck sweater, dark brown trousers, worn black boots, and brown leather gloves that had seen too many winters. He looked like a man who had survived everything except peace. Marianne Cole came around the counter before anyone else could speak. Marianne was 48, with warm brown eyes, chestnut hair pinned into a practical bun, and the steady posture of a woman who had spent half her life calming frightened animals and frightened people. She was not soft in the way strangers expected kind women to be. Her kindness had edges. She knew when to step closer and when to keep a safe distance. She wore a pale blue button-up shirt beneath a gray cardigan, black trousers, soft black work shoes, and a small name badge clipped near her heart. In one arm, she held a clipboard filled with adoption forms, behavior notes, and the quiet weight of decisions that could change lives. "Mr. Harlan?" she asked gently. Walter turned his head toward her voice. "That depends," he said. "Are you the person who decides whether an old blind man is still allowed to be useful?" A small smile touched Marianne's face, though sadness passed through her eyes before it disappeared. "I'm Marianne Cole. I coordinate the adoption evaluations." Walter nodded once. "Then I suppose I'm in the right place." She offered her arm but did not push it toward him. Walter noticed that. People usually grabbed blind men before asking whether they wanted help. Marianne waited. After a brief pause, Walter rested two gloved fingers lightly on her sleeve. "Thank you," he said, and the words sounded like they cost him more than they should have. As they moved down the hall, the barks grew clearer. Walter heard nails clicking behind steel doors, tails thudding against kennel walls, a bowl sliding across concrete, a dog whining in short, nervous bursts. He had filled out the application weeks ago, though he nearly tore it up twice. On paper, the request sounded simple. Elderly veteran, visually impaired, seeking calm companion dog for emotional support and daily routine assistance. But Paper did not know how quiet his house had become. Paper did not know about the porch chair he never sat in anymore, because no one sat beside him. Paper did not know about 3 in the morning, when old memories came back smelling of smoke and metal and rain, and Walter woke with one hand, reaching for men who had been gone longer than some of the staff had been alive. "We have several older dogs who may be a good fit," Marianne said. Gentle temperaments, low drive, comfortable with slow routines. Walter gave a faint, dry laugh. Low drive. That sounds like something my doctor would prescribe. Marianne smiled politely. You wrote that you had experience with working dogs before your vision loss. A little, Walter said. After I retired, I helped with rescue dogs. Not professionally, just enough to learn that dogs tell the truth faster than people. Marianne glanced at him. And what truth are you hoping to find here? Walter's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his cane. I'm not sure yet. They passed the first row of kennels. A golden retriever pressed his nose against the gate and wagged so hard his whole body bent in half. A gray-muzzled Labrador lay quietly on a blanket, lifting only his eyes. A small terrier barked 3 times, then seemed embarrassed by his own courage. Marianne described each one, her voice warm and careful, but Walter felt himself drifting. They all sounded good, safe, ready, kind. And yet none of them reached that silent place inside him where grief lived with its boots still on. Then the hallway changed. The air grew colder near a locked door at the far end. The dogs behind them quieted as if they, too, knew what lived beyond that line. Marianne slowed. Walter felt the hesitation through her sleeve. That wing is restricted, she said. We won't be going there. Before Walter could ask why, a violent snarl tore through the building. It was not a bark. It was a rupture. Steel clanged hard enough to vibrate beneath Walter's boots, followed by a deep, furious growl that rolled down the corridor like thunder trapped in a cage. A young volunteer gasped behind them. Someone shouted from the restricted wing, "Ranger, back, back!" Marianne's grip tightened. "We should keep moving." Walter did not move. His head turned toward the sound, pale eyes fixed on nothing, face suddenly still in the way soldiers became still when the past stepped into the room. "Who is that?" he asked. Marianne's answer came too quickly. "Not an option." "That wasn't my question." She exhaled, slowly. "His name is Ranger, Belgian Malinois, 6 years old, retired military working dog." Another metallic crash echoed. The growl came again, lower this time, not weaker, but more controlled. Walter listened beneath the fury. A dog's anger had shape, fear had rhythm. Pain had a sound of its own. This sound had all 3. "What happened to him?" Walter asked. Marianne looked toward the restricted door. "He served with Sergeant Miles Donovan. They were together through 2 deployments, detection, tracking, rescue support. By every report, Ranger was exceptional." Her voice lowered. "Then Sergeant Donovan died during an overseas incident. Ranger survived. After that, he changed. Changed how? He became unpredictable, territorial. He has injured staff. He broke through one kennel door and nearly destroyed an evaluation room. He doesn't tolerate touch, commands, or proximity from anyone except the handlers who feed him, and even they use strict barriers." Walter's face did not soften, but something in his mouth tightened. "So you locked him away." Marianne did not take offense. "We kept him alive. There are places that would not have." The answer settled between them, honest and heavy. Walter was about to let Marianne guide him away when the growling stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The sudden silence was so complete that even the dogs in the other wing seemed to hold their breath. From behind the restricted door came a slow scrape of claws against concrete, then one sharp inhale, as if the animal on the other side had caught a scent that did not belong to the present. Walter reached toward the left pocket of his olive coat, where an old metal tag wrapped in cloth rested against his chest. The tag had belonged to Caleb Reed, a 22-year-old sailor Walter had carried through smoke decades ago and never brought home alive. Walter did not understand how a dog behind a steel door could know anything about that, but the air changed around him. Then, from the isolation wing, the most dangerous K9 in Cedar Ridge let out a low, trembling whine. Marianne went pale. "That's not possible," she whispered. Walter turned his face toward her. "What?" "He doesn't make that sound." Footsteps hurried from the restricted wing. Derek Shaw appeared at the corner, broad-shouldered and tense, wearing a black utility jacket over a mustard-yellow Cedar Ridge polo, gray cargo pants, heavy black work boots, and thick protective gloves clipped to his belt. He was 35, with close-cut black hair, a square jaw, blue eyes that had learned caution the hard way, and a thin scar near his left wrist where Ranger had once caught him during a failed evaluation. Derek was not cruel. He was afraid, and fear had made him practical. "Marianne," he said sharply, "why is a visitor near this wing?" Walter answered before she could. "Because the visitor has ears." Derek looked at the old man's cane, then at his clouded eyes, and discomfort crossed his face. "Sir, you need to step back." "I haven't stepped forward. That dog is dangerous." Walter nodded. "Most wounded things are, if everyone reaches for them like they're a problem to solve." Derek frowned, but another sound came from the restricted wing before he could reply. Not a snarl this time. A soft pawing at the lower part of the kennel door. Derek's expression shifted from warning to confusion. Marianne made the decision to call Dr. Hannah Voss. She arrived 10 minutes later from the behavioral assessment office, moving quickly but without panic. Dr. Hannah was 45, tall and lean, with sharp gray-blue eyes, dark blonde hair tied low at the back of her neck, and a face that seemed built for observation rather than comfort. She wore an ivory veterinary coat over a navy turtleneck, black trousers, brown ankle boots, and carried a small notebook full of behavior marks and incident codes. Hannah did not believe in miracles, destiny, or sentimental shortcuts. She believed in breathing patterns, ear position, scent triggers, trauma responses, and safe distance. She listened to Marianne explain what had happened, then studied Walter with professional skepticism. "Mr. Harlan, I understand you have prior experience with rescue dogs. Enough to know when I shouldn't pretend to be an expert." Hannah seemed to appreciate that. "Good. Then you'll understand this clearly. You will not approach Ranger today. You will not touch the gate, speak loudly, or put your hand through any barrier. We observe only." Walter nodded. "Fair." Derek looked unhappy. "Doctor, we shouldn't encourage this." Hannah glanced toward the restricted door. "We're not encouraging. We're documenting an anomaly." The first safety door buzzed open, but Walter was kept outside the marked line on the floor. Marianne stood beside him. Derek remained near the emergency release. Hannah watched through the reinforced window. Inside the final kennel, Ranger stood in shadow. Walter could not see him, but the others could. A powerful Belgian Malinois with a deep fawn mahogany coat, a black mask over his muzzle and eyes, upright ears, a lean muscular body, and amber eyes that burned with exhausted intensity. A faded tan tactical K9 vest hung unused on the wall outside his kennel. Ranger's front paws were planted wide, his chest rising hard, his lips trembling over his teeth, as if rage was the only language he had left. But he did not slam the bars. He stared at Walter. Walter stood with both hands on the top of his cane. He did not call the dog. He did not soften his voice into baby talk. He simply breathed and waited, the way he had once waited beside wounded men until medics arrived. "Hello, Ranger," he said at last. The dog's ears twitched. Derek's hand moved toward the safety control, but Hannah raised 2 fingers, stopping him. Ranger took 1 step closer, then another. His nose worked rapidly, pulling scent through the bars, past disinfectant and metal, past Marianne's cardigan and Derek's gloves, until it found the old coat, the cloth-wrapped tag, and the human grief Walter had carried for nearly half a lifetime. Walter's throat tightened. He felt ridiculous for it, standing in a kennel hallway, nearly crying over a dog he had never touched. But grief was not logical. It recognized its own reflection in places the mind did not approve. "You lost someone," Walter whispered. Ranger lowered his head. The growl that followed was faint, broken at the edges, less a threat than a warning from a creature afraid of being misunderstood again. Marianne covered her mouth with 1 hand. Hannah's expression changed, not into belief, but into attention sharpened by surprise. Derek stared, as if the floor had shifted under him. Walter slowly removed 1 glove, not to reach forward, only to feel the air. His bare hand trembled slightly. "I did too," he said. "A long time ago. I kept breathing, and he didn't. People called that surviving. They never told me surviving could feel like stealing." Ranger pressed his muzzle near the lower bars and released another quiet whine. This time, everyone heard it. Marianne gently touched Walter's sleeve. "Mr. Harlan," she said, voice unsteady, "we should stop for today." Walter nodded, though his face remained turned toward Ranger. He understood rules. Rules had kept men alive. Sometimes rules also kept pain locked in rooms because no one knew what else to do with it. "All right," he said. "We stop." He took one careful step back. Ranger's body stiffened. Derek tensed, expecting the explosion. It did not come. Ranger only followed the movement with his eyes, breathing harder, as if the distance itself hurt. Walter paused at the safety line. "I'll come back," he said quietly. Marianne looked at him in surprise. Hannah opened her mouth, perhaps to object, but stopped when Ranger lowered himself slowly to the concrete floor. The most feared dog in Cedar Ridge rested his head between his paws, still watching the old blind man with the cane. For the first time in months, Ranger did not end a human encounter by attacking the bars. He ended it by waiting, and that frightened the staff more than the violence ever had, because violence was familiar. Hope was not. By the time Walter reached the lobby again, the snow outside had thickened. Marianne walked beside him in silence. The safe dogs in the first wing barked and wagged as he passed, but Walter barely heard them now. Something behind the restricted door had reached into the sealed room of his own chest and knocked from the inside. At the front entrance, Marianne helped him find the handle, then hesitated. "Walter," she said, using his first name for the first time, "please understand. Whatever happened today, Ranger is not available for adoption." Walter pulled his glove back on slowly. "I didn't ask to adopt him. Then what are you asking?" He turned his clouded eyes toward the distant sound of the restricted wing. Ranger was silent now, but Walter could still feel him somehow, like a storm waiting beyond the trees. "I'm asking why a dog everyone calls dangerous sounded relieved when he found an old man who can't even see him." Marianne had no answer. Walter stepped into the snow, cane tapping once on the icy walkway. Behind him, deep inside Cedar Ridge, Ranger remained pressed against the front of his kennel, listening until the old man's footsteps disappeared. Walter Harlan returned to Cedar Ridge K9 Recovery Center the next morning before the snow had finished melting from the road. The sky above the facility was pale and heavy, and the wind moved through the pines with the low whisper of something unfinished. He stepped from the county transport van slowly, one hand gripping the dark wooden cane, the other holding the edge of his old olive coat closed against the cold. The driver asked if he needed help walking to the entrance, but Walter only shook his head. "I need the path more than the hand," he said, and tapped forward across the salted walkway. Inside, the lobby sounded different than it had the day before. Fewer barks, more murmurs. People knew he had come back. That made Walter almost turn around. He had spent years avoiding rooms where people waited to see what grief would do next. But then, from deep in the restricted wing, came one low sound. Not a bark, not a snarl, just a scrape of claws against concrete. Walter stopped at the reception desk and listened. Ranger knew he was there. Marianne Cole came out from behind the adoption counter with a folder pressed against her chest. She wore the same gray cardigan and blue shirt, but her face looked less rested, as if the night had left questions under her eyes. "You came early," she said. Walter turned toward her voice. "Old men and troubled dogs don't sleep much." Marianne did not smile this time. Dr. Voss agreed to observe one controlled session. "That does not mean Ranger's status has changed. I understand. No touching, no leaning toward the bars, no sudden movements. You'll sit behind the yellow safety line. Derek will be present. So will I. If Dr. Voss ends the session, it ends immediately." Walter nodded. "Rules keep people alive." Marianne studied him. "And dogs?" Walter's hand tightened around the cane. "Sometimes rules keep dogs alive too. Sometimes they keep them alone." Marianne looked away for a moment, because she knew both things could be true. They led Walter down the corridor, past the safe kennels where gentle dogs watched him with curious eyes. The golden retriever from yesterday wagged again, pressing his nose through the gate as if offering a second chance. A small terrier spun in place. The old Labrador lifted his head and gave one quiet breath. Walter heard them all, and guilt moved through him strangely. He had come for a calm companion, a sensible dog. A dog that would make Marianne's job easy and his son's Sunday phone calls less worried. Instead, He was walking toward the only dog in the building everyone believed should stay behind steel. The restricted wing door buzzed open. Cold air rolled out. Derek Shaw waited inside with his arms crossed, black utility jacket zipped to his throat, jaw tight, blue eyes already fixed on Ranger's kennel. Derek was strong, practical, and built like a man who had learned to trust procedures more than instincts. The small scar near his left wrist showed pale against his skin when he adjusted his glove. He gave Walter a short nod, polite, but not warm. "Morning, sir." Walter heard the tension. "Still afraid of him?" Derek's mouth tightened. "I respect him." "That wasn't my question." Derek said nothing, and Walter knew the answer. Dr. Hannah Voss stood near the observation window with a notebook in hand. Her ivory veterinary coat looked too clean for a place full of damaged animals, but her eyes were not clean of worry. They were sharp, gray-blue, and focused, taking in everything. Walter's breathing, Derek's hand position, Marianne's distance from the gate, the angle of Ranger's ears behind the bars. "Mr. Harlan," she said, "before we begin, I need you to understand something. Yesterday was not a breakthrough. It was an unusual response. A dog with trauma can shift from calm to defensive in seconds." Walter turned his clouded eyes toward her. "So can men." Hannah paused, then wrote something in her notebook. "That is exactly why we move slowly." She pointed to a wooden chair placed behind the yellow line. Marianne guided Walter to it. He sat with care, placed his cane across his knees, and folded both hands over it. He did not face Ranger perfectly, because he could not see the kennel, but Ranger could see him. The Belgian Malinois stood in the shadows of the final enclosure. Deep fawn mahogany coat tight over lean muscle, black mask making his amber eyes seem even brighter. His tan tactical vest still hung unused on the outer hook, a silent reminder of the life he once understood. Ranger did not rush the bars when Walter sat down. He paced once, slow and controlled, nose working, ears forward. Derek frowned. "He's already different." Hannah did not look away. "Document, don't interpret." Walter heard the dog's paws stop. He spoke softly, not like a trainer, not like a man trying to prove courage, but like someone sitting beside a hospital bed after the doctors had run out of promises. "Morning, Ranger." The dog's breathing changed. Not relaxed, not safe, but listening. "I won't ask you to like me," Walter continued. "Most days, I don't ask that of people either." Marianne lowered her eyes, and Derek's expression shifted despite himself. For several minutes, Walter simply talked. He told Ranger about the sound of rain on tin roofs in old barracks, about coffee so bad men drank it only because it was hot, about boots lined up under bunks, about young soldiers pretending to snore so no one would know they were scared. He did not mention Miles. Not yet. Dr. Hannah had warned him not to use possible trigger names until Ranger's baseline behavior was stable. Walter respected that. The dog paced at first, then slowed. His claws clicked less sharply. His tail remained low but no longer rigid. He lowered his head to sniff near the gate, then stepped back as if ashamed of wanting to come closer. Walter could not see the movement, but he heard the hesitation. "You don't have to forgive the room," he said. "Just breathe in it." Ranger gave a low rumble. Derek shifted his weight. Hannah lifted 2 fingers, signaling him to stay still. The rumble faded on its own. Then Walter reached into his coat pocket, not quickly, not toward Ranger, only inward, toward his own chest, and his fingertips touched the cloth-wrapped metal tag of Caleb Reed. Ranger froze. The air in the isolation wing seemed to tighten. His nose lifted, nostrils flaring, pulling a scent too old for any human to name. Worn metal, old fabric, smoke memory, salt from an old man's hand. Ranger took 1 step toward the bars and made a sound so quiet it barely crossed the room, a small broken exhale that did not belong to a monster. Walter stopped breathing for a moment. "You smell the dead on me," he whispered. Dr. Hannah's pen stopped moving. Marianne turned pale. Derek looked at Ranger as if seeing him for the first time. The dog did not attack. He lowered his head until his muzzle nearly touched the bottom bar, and for one impossible second, the whole room felt less like a kennel and more like a church. Walter pulled his hand from the pocket and placed it back on the cane. "Not today," he murmured. "Some memories deserve warning before we open the door." Hannah let out a slow breath, professional mask returning, though her voice had softened. Good choice. Ranger remained near the bars, eyes fixed on Walter, chest rising with slow effort. The session continued, but something had changed. It was no longer only an evaluation of Ranger. It had become an evaluation of whether anyone in that building was willing to believe pain could look like danger when it had nowhere safe to go. Marianne eventually asked Walter, "What was in your pocket?" He hesitated long enough that she nearly withdrew the question. "A tag," he said, "from a young man named Caleb Reed. He served under me a long time ago." Derek glanced down. "He died?" Walter's jaw tightened. "He told me to go home. I did." "He didn't." No one spoke. Even Ranger seemed to listen harder. Before Hannah could end the session, a new voice entered the wing from behind them. "I hope I'm not interrupting something important." The voice was smooth, expensive, and practiced. Marianne stiffened. Derek turned sharply. Walter did not know the man, but he knew voices that smiled before the face did. The newcomer was Garrison Vale, a 62-year-old donor whose name appeared on plaques near the lobby and on the renovated outdoor kennels. He was medium tall with a full, well-fed build, silver hair combed back neatly, clean-shaven cheeks, and cold blue eyes that rarely matched his polite smile. He wore a black cashmere coat, a white dress shirt, a gray scarf, polished black shoes, and a gold ring engraved with a sharp letter V. He looked like a man who had never raised his voice because money usually arrived before anger had to. "Mr. Vale," Marianne said carefully, "we weren't expecting you. I heard there was an unusual incident yesterday with our difficult veteran." He glanced toward Ranger, and though Walter could not see it, the dog's body stiffened at once. "I came to make sure the center is handling it responsibly." Dr. Hannah stepped slightly in front of the observation window. "This is a controlled behavioral session." Garrison's smile stayed pleasant. "With a civilian?" "With a retired Navy SEAL who has prior rescue dog experience." "A blind 70-year-old man," Garrison corrected softly, as if concern made the words harmless. Walter turned his head toward him. "You say that like blindness removed my ears." The corner of Derek's mouth twitched before he controlled it. Garrison gave a courteous little laugh. "No offense intended, Mr. Harlan. I only care about safety." Ranger emitted a low growl. Not loud, not explosive. Focused. Derek's hand moved automatically toward his belt. Hannah watched Ranger's ears, tail, shoulders. Marianne watched Garrison. Walter listened to the man's breathing. For half a second, Garrison inhaled wrong. Too sharp, too quick, like someone who had stepped on a memory and hoped no one heard it. Garrison continued, "Perhaps this proves what I've said for months. Ranger should be transferred to a more isolated facility. Cedar Ridge does wonderful work, but some animals are beyond rehabilitation." Ranger's growl deepened. Walter placed one hand flat on his cane. "Funny thing," he said. "He didn't growl like that when I came in." Garrison's smile thinned. "Dogs are unpredictable." Walter nodded. "Men too, Doctor." Hannah ended the session immediately, not because Ranger had failed, but because the room had gained a variable she did not trust. Marianne guided Walter to stand. Derek remained between Ranger and the corridor. Garrison stepped aside with polished politeness, but Ranger followed him with his eyes until the man moved out of the wing. Walter heard every inch of that silence. It was the silence of a dog remembering a scent. It was also the silence of a man pretending not to be remembered. Back in the lobby, Marianne apologized for the interruption. Walter shook his head. "Don't. You shouldn't have been put in that position. I learned something. About Ranger? About the man in the black coat." Marianne looked toward the hallway, uneasy. "Garrison Vale has funded half this facility. Without him, some of these dogs wouldn't have shelter." Walter buttoned his coat slowly. "Good deeds make fine curtains." She did not answer. Outside, snow had begun again, soft but steady. Walter stepped toward the door, then stopped. From the restricted wing, Ranger barked 3 times. Short, sharp, controlled. Not rage, not panic, a signal. Derek's voice echoed faintly. "What the hell was that?" Dr. Hannah answered, too far away for Walter to catch the words. But Walter understood enough. Ranger was not calling after him this time. Ranger was warning them. That night, Long after Walter had returned to his small house at the edge of Birch Hollow, the cameras at Cedar Ridge recorded Ranger standing awake in his kennel. At 2:13 a.m., while the rest of the facility slept, he rose without command and faced the rear fence. Snow blew sideways across the outdoor lights. For nearly 3 minutes, nothing happened. Then, a black pickup rolled to a stop beyond the service gate with its headlights off. Ranger did not slam the bars. He did not lose control. He stood perfectly still, ears forward, body rigid with purpose. Then he barked 3 times again, the same short pattern Walter had heard before leaving. By the time Derek reached the rear hallway, the truck was already gone. But in the snow near the fence, something dark fluttered from the wire. A torn strip of expensive black fabric that smelled faintly of smoke, gasoline, and a cologne Ranger had not forgotten. Morning came to Cedar Ridge under a sky the color of wet ash. Snow clung to the rear fence in uneven ridges, and the service yard behind the K-9 center looked strangely exposed, as if the night had peeled something private away from the building. Derek Shaw stood near the wire with his shoulders hunched against the cold, one gloved hand holding a torn strip of black fabric in an evidence bag. The fabric was expensive, thick, and smooth at the edge where it had not been ripped by the fence. It did not belong to any handler's jacket, any volunteer uniform, or any winter coverall stored at the center. It smelled faintly of gasoline, smoke, and a sharp cologne that made Ranger restless even from inside the restricted wing. Walter Harlan arrived just after 8, brought by the same county transport van, his cane tapping the walkway with that slow, patient rhythm the staff had already begun to recognize. Marianne met him at the entrance before he could reach the lobby. Her face was drawn, her brown eyes darker than usual, and the folder in her hands was no longer an adoption file. "Something happened last night," she said. Walter stopped, snow melting on the shoulders of his old olive coat. "I know." Marianne stared at him. "How could you know?" Walter turned his clouded eyes toward the rear of the building. "Because Ranger was warning you before I left." Marianne did not argue. She led him inside, but the building no longer felt like a rehabilitation center. It felt like a place that had been searched by fear. 2 staff members whispered near the office door. A volunteer pushed a mop across a clean floor that did not need mopping. Every kennel in the first wing was quieter than usual, as if the dogs had absorbed the tension from their handlers. Dr. Hannah Voss stood outside the restricted corridor, ivory coat buttoned, notebook under one arm, her sharp gray-blue eyes moving between Derek, Marianne, and the evidence bag. She had slept little, but lack of sleep only made her more precise. "The rear gate sensor was disabled for 4 minutes," she said when Walter approached. "No forced entry at the main doors. Whoever came knew where the blind spots were." Walter's hand tightened around his cane. "People with money know where doors are. People with guilt know where cameras are." Derek looked up from the evidence bag. "You think this was Vale?" Marianne shot him a warning look, but Walter heard the name land in the room like a dropped tool. "I think Ranger recognized something last night," Walter said. "Whether it was Mr. Vale or someone carrying his scent, that's what we need to learn." The police arrived 20 minutes later. Officer Nora Blake entered through the rear hall with snow on her boots and a hard look that seemed built for bad weather. Nora was 42, tall and athletic, with a sharp, composed face, gray-green eyes, and dark blonde hair cut at her jawline in a style too practical to be vain. Her navy winter police coat carried a small badge at the chest, and her voice had the firm calm of someone who did not waste words on panic. She had grown up in Cedar Ridge, left for the State Police Academy, and returned after her father's illness taught her that duty was not always found in bigger cities. Nora listened to Marianne's report, Derek's timeline, and Dr. Hannah's observations without interrupting. Then she looked toward Walter. "And you are?" Walter angled his head toward her voice. "Walter Harlan, the retired SEAL visiting the restricted dog." "That sounds more dramatic than I feel." Nora's expression did not change, but a hint of dry humor touched her eyes. "Most dangerous things don't feel dramatic at first," Walter nodded. "That includes dogs, men, and secrets." Nora began at the fence. She examined the disabled sensor box, the tire marks half filled by fresh snow, and the torn black fabric. Then she moved inside, asking who had access to the rear gate code. Marianne listed staff, senior volunteers, maintenance, and donors with emergency privileges. Nora's pen stopped at that last category. Donors? Marianne hesitated. Only one with after-hours access. Garrison Vale. It's for facility emergencies. He funded the expansion wing. Walter listened without moving. He heard Marianne's discomfort, Derek's anger, Hannah's restraint. Nora heard it too. Money makes people generous, Nora said. It also makes them difficult to question. She ordered the staff records pulled and asked to see the security room. But before Marianne could lead her there, a harsh sound erupted from the restricted wing. Ranger barked once, then began clawing at the inside corner of his kennel, not toward the hallway, not toward Walter, but toward the storage wing on the opposite side of the building. Derek went still. That's new. Hannah's eyes narrowed. No, that's directional. Walter turned his head toward the sound and lifted one hand for silence. Ranger barked again, shorter this time, then scraped the concrete in 3 hard strokes. Walter's face changed. The old man was no longer standing in a hallway. He was listening across decades. He isn't calling for me, Walter whispered. He's pointing. Nora looked from Walter to Hannah. Pointing where? Ranger answered before anyone else could. He struck the kennel floor once more, then faced the locked storage corridor where the personal effects of retired K9 handlers were kept. The growl that followed was not wild. It was focused, wounded, and certain. Dr. Hannah spoke quietly, as if afraid a louder voice would break the meaning of it. He knows something was taken. The storage wing smelled of cardboard, old leather, cleaning supplies, and the dry stillness of things nobody had been ready to throw away. Marianne unlocked the door with shaking hands. Rows of labeled containers lined the shelves. Collars, retired harnesses, medical records, folded blankets, old photographs, and personal items waiting for families who sometimes never came. Nora moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything, until she saw the broken seal on a gray military storage bin halfway down the second row. Marianne read the label and closed her eyes. Dunovan Miles Personal K, 9 Service Effects, Derek swore under his breath. Dr. Hannah lifted the lid with gloved hands. Inside, the container was nearly empty. Only a few loose paper tags, a faded inventory slip, and one small brass button remained in the bottom corner. The duffel bag itself was gone. Walter stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, cane planted before him. He did not need to see the empty space to understand it. They didn't come for the dog, he said. They came for the dead man. Marianne pressed a hand to her mouth. Miles's mother never picked up the bag. She said she couldn't bear to open it. We promised to keep it safe. Nora turned to her. Was anything valuable inside? Not in the way thieves usually mean. Old uniform pieces, a leash, training patches, maybe letters. Hannah checked the inventory slip. There's a notation here. She held it closer. Personal field notebook, listed as unverified, pending family inquiry. Nora's posture sharpened. A notebook? Derek looked confused. Why would a thief risk breaking into a K9 center for an old notebook? Walter's voice was low. Because old paper can outlive powerful men. The room fell silent. In the distance, Ranger barked again, not frantically now, but with a steady insistence, as if every second spent doubting was another betrayal of the handler he had already lost once. Nora requested a list of everyone who worked the previous evening. The staff gathered in the small training classroom, where fluorescent lights hummed above folding chairs and posters about K9 stress signals curled at the corners. Most looked frightened, but innocent. Then Walter heard a sound near the back, a backpack zipper closing too fast. He turned his head slightly. A young male voice whispered, "It's nothing." Nora noticed Walter's reaction. Who said that? A thin young volunteer stood near the door, face pale, hands trembling around the straps of a brown canvas backpack. Marianne's expression softened with worry. Eli? Eli Brooks was 19, narrow-shouldered and underfed-looking, with messy blonde hair that fell into his light blue eyes and a nervous mouth that seemed always ready to apologize. He wore a faded gray hoodie under a green volunteer jacket, worn jeans, old black sneakers, and the exhausted look of someone carrying adult problems without adult strength. He was known for staying late to clean kennels no one else wanted to clean, and for sending most of his small stipend home to his sick mother. He did not look like a criminal. He looked like a boy who had made one terrible choice and had been waiting for it to find him. Nora asked him to set the backpack on the table. Eli shook his head. I didn't do anything. No one had accused him yet. Derek stepped forward, anger rising. Eli. The boy's eyes filled instantly. I didn't know what he was taking. Marianne inhaled sharply. Nora's voice stayed calm. Open the bag. Eli's fingers fumbled with the zipper. Inside were gloves, a half-eaten protein bar, a cheap flashlight, and beneath them, wrapped in a paper towel, the small brass button missing from Miles Donovan's duffel. Marianne looked devastated. Eli began crying before Nora spoke. He said it was just an old bag, the boy said. He said nobody needed it. He gave me cash. My mom's oxygen bill was overdue, and I thought, his voice broke. I thought if it was just something old, maybe it didn't matter. Walter felt the words settle heavily in his chest. He had heard young men justify fear before. Not because they were evil, because fear had cornered them until the wrong door looked like the only door. Nora questioned Eli gently but firmly. He described the man who approached him 2 nights earlier at a gas station outside town. Late 50s or early 60s. Dark coat, polished shoes not made for snow, a scarf pulled up near his mouth, voice rough but controlled, and a gold ring with a V engraved into it. Eli never heard the man say his name, but he smelled mint tobacco and expensive cologne when the man leaned close to give him the envelope of cash. He knew the rear code, Eli said. He said I just had to keep the gate from triggering the main alarm. He told me the cameras wouldn't see him if he stayed near the service fence, Nora wrote quickly. Marianne's face hardened with a grief that had become anger. Derek looked as if he might punch the wall. Dr. Hannah only asked one question. Did he touch you? Eli blinked. What? His gloves. His sleeve. Anything Ranger could smell on you. Eli nodded weakly. He grabbed my shoulder when he warned me not to talk. Hannah had Eli's volunteer jacket sealed as evidence. Then, under strict control, she allowed Ranger to smell the air from the hallway while Eli stood behind a closed safety barrier far away. Ranger did not lose control. He did not lunge blindly. He moved to the front of his kennel, nose high, amber eyes burning, and fixed on the direction of the classroom. A low growl rose in his chest, but it was different from the violence the staff remembered. It had purpose. It named a trail. Walter stood beside Hannah, outside the safety line, listening. He knows the scent, Walter said. Hannah nodded slowly. Yes, but he's not targeting Eli as the source. He's identifying Eli as contaminated by the source. Nora looked at her. Meaning? Meaning the boy isn't who Ranger wants. Walter's hand tightened around Caleb's tag inside his pocket. The dog wants the man who took Miles's bag. By late afternoon, Nora had enough to open a formal investigation, but not enough to accuse Garrison Vale publicly. Money built walls around men like him. A torn fabric strip, a frightened volunteer, and a dog's reaction would not bring those walls down. Walter knew that. He had seen guilty men survive worse because the truth arrived without paperwork. Marianne walked him toward the lobby as the winter light dimmed behind the windows. I'm sorry, she said. For what? You came here looking for a companion. Now you're standing in the middle of something ugly. Walter gave a tired smile. At 70, Marianne, ugly doesn't surprise me. What surprises me is when something wounded still tries to do right. From the restricted wing, Ranger suddenly barked once. Everyone in the lobby turned. Then the dog barked again and began pawing toward the back of his kennel. His body angled not toward Walter, not toward Eli, but toward the old outdoor training field beyond the rear wing. Derek called from the corridor. Doctor, you need to see this. Doctor. Hannah hurried back, Nora behind her. Walter remained still, listening to Ranger's claws, the rhythm urgent but controlled. Marianne whispered, What is he doing now? Walter turned his blind face toward the snow-covered yard outside. Remembering, he said. And I think he wants us to follow where Miles taught him to remember. The old training field behind Cedar Ridge had not been used in months. Snow covered it in uneven white layers, softening the broken edges of the obstacle ramps and hiding the deep paw marks left from years of working dogs learning to trust commands, scent, and silence. From the rear windows of the center, the field looked harmless, almost peaceful, But everyone who had worked at Cedar Ridge long enough knew why the gate had stayed locked since Ranger came home. The last time Derek Shaw had tried to walk Ranger near that field, the Belgian Malinois had collapsed into such a violent state of panic that 3 handlers had needed to pull him back. Not because he wanted to attack the field, because every board, every post, every length of old rope carried the memory of Sergeant Miles Donovan. That was where Miles had trained Ranger during stateside recovery sessions. That was where the dog had learned to mark hidden scents, crawl under collapsed beams, stop before unstable ground, and wait for Miles's hand signal before moving again. To the staff, it had become a closed-off place. To Ranger, it had remained a door that no one knew how to open. Dr. Hannah Voss refused to let emotion rush the decision. She stood in the rear prep room with Officer Nora Blake, Marianne Cole, Derek Shaw, Walter Harlan, and Ranger separated behind the final kennel gate, outlining the safety plan in a firm voice. "This is not a search operation," Hannah said. "This is a controlled behavioral exposure and scent response evaluation. Ranger stays on a long lead. Derek handles the lead. Nora observes. Marianne remains by the emergency gate. Mr. Harlan stays outside the field boundary, unless I say otherwise." Walter, seated on a folding chair with his cane resting against his knee, turned his clouded eyes toward her. "You don't have to worry about me running into danger, Doctor." These knees retired before I did. Hannah did not smile, but the corner of her mouth softened. "I worry about everyone equally. It saves time." Nora gave a quiet hum that might have been approval. She had spent the early morning securing a limited evidence preservation order for the training field, just enough to keep anyone from tampering with it while she documented whatever Ranger might locate. She still did not like relying on a traumatized dog's behavior, but she liked ignoring evidence even less. Derek prepared Ranger with hands that were steadier than his face. Ranger stood at the kennel threshold, 6 years old, lean and powerful beneath his deep fawn mahogany coat, black mask sharp against his muzzle, amber eyes fixed beyond the corridor toward the snow-covered field. He wore only a secure working collar and a long black lead. Hannah had decided against the tan tactical vest because the scent and pressure of old gear might trigger him too quickly. Ranger's ears were forward, but his tail hung low. He was not calm, he was contained. Walter listened to the dog's breathing and heard the fight inside it. "Go forward, stay back, remember, forget." "Ranger," Walter said softly. The dog's head turned at once. Derek looked down, surprised again by the speed of that response. Walter did not give a command. He only said, "Slow is still forward." Ranger blinked once, then stepped out of the kennel. Nobody spoke after that. The sound of his nails on the floor became the only thing moving through the hallway. The rear door opened onto cold air and a field of white. Walter remained at the edge of the concrete walkway, one gloved hand on his cane, Marianne beside him. Nora entered first, scanning the perimeter, her navy police coat dark against the snow. Derek followed with Ranger on the long lead, and Hannah walked slightly behind them with her notebook, watching the dog's body rather than the ground. Ranger crossed the threshold of the old field and froze. His muscles tightened so sharply that the lead pulled straight. Derek stopped immediately. Hannah raised one hand. No pressure. Ranger's nose lifted. His nostrils trembled. The wind carried old scents from under the snow. Wood rot, rusted metal, frozen earth, handler gloves, and something beneath it all that belonged to memory rather than weather. Walter heard the silence stretch and knew Ranger was no longer only in Cedar Ridge. The dog was standing in 2 places at once, the present field and the lost field where Miles Donovan still walked in Ranger's mind. "Walter," Hannah called without taking her eyes off Ranger. "Say something neutral, no names." Walter nodded and faced the wind. "Cold morning," he said, voice low but steady. "Good working weather if a man has better joints than mine." Ranger's ears moved. "I used to hate mornings like this," Walter continued. "Then I learned the cold tells the truth. It shows you what aches. It shows you what still moves." Ranger took one step, then another. Derek followed without pulling. The dog moved toward the first broken ramp, sniffed the snow, then turned away. He circled an old tunnel frame and stopped near a leaning wooden platform at the far side of the field. It was half buried, the boards dark with moisture, One corner sunk into the ground. Derek looked back at Hannah. This was one of Miles's scent mark stations. Hannah's pen paused. Nora moved closer, careful to step only where Ranger had not disturbed the snow. Marianne, watching from the gate, whispered, "He remembered." Ranger lowered his head to the platform and began pawing at the snow, not frantically, not like a trapped animal, but in 3 deliberate strokes. Then he stopped and looked back toward Walter. The old man could not see the look, but he felt the silence turn toward him. Ranger pawed again, 3 strokes, then waited. Walter's face lost color. His gloved fingers tightened around the top of his cane. 3, he whispered. Marianne looked at him. What? Walter swallowed hard. Caleb used to knock 3 times on the engine hood when a vehicle was safe to move. He said 1 knock meant hurry, 2 meant trouble, 3 meant trust me. Ranger pawed once more at the hidden boards, and for a moment, even Nora stopped writing. No one said it was supernatural. No one needed to. The field had produced a signal from 2 different wars, carried by a dog who had never known Caleb Reed, but somehow understood the language of men who did not come home. Derek knelt and brushed away snow. Hannah told him to wait for Nora to photograph the area first. Nora took pictures from several angles, then allowed Derek to lift the loose boards. Beneath them, packed into a shallow hollow under the platform, was a small metal lockbox. It was dented, weathered, and wrapped in a strip of waterproof cloth, stiff with age. Ranger backed away the moment Derek touched it, then sat down hard in the snow, trembling from shoulders to paws. Walter heard the change in the lead, the shift of Derek's boots, the small, involuntary whine from Ranger's throat. He found what Miles taught him to find, Walter said. Hannah crouched near Ranger but did not touch him. Good boy, she said quietly, not as praise for obedience, but as acknowledgement of labor. Ranger did not look at her. He looked toward the box. Nora opened the lockbox with gloved hands after documenting the cloth. Inside was no notebook, no stack of papers, no damning confession, only a folded waterproof sheet, a rusted key too small for a door, and a thin strip of old cloth bearing the faint outline of a military inventory stamp. Marianne let out a breath of disappointment she tried to hide. Derek looked angry. That's it? After everything? Nora unfolded the sheet carefully. Written on it were numbers, initials, and what looked like a storage code. FM12, B7, V consignment, and a date from the month before Miles Donovan died. Hannah leaned closer. FM could mean field manual. Nora shook her head. Or feed mill. Walter turned his head slightly. There's an old feed mill west of town. Marianne looked at him. How do you know that? You hear things when people think a blind man isn't listening. The driver mentioned it yesterday. Said the blind was closed past Vale property because the old mill roof was sinking. Nora's expression sharpened at the word Vale. Before anyone could discuss it further, the rear gate buzzer sounded. Marianne turned from the field and went rigid. A black SUV had pulled into the staff lot. Not the pickup from the camera footage, but just as polished, just as out of place among snowplows and utility vans. Garrison Vale stepped out wearing his black cashmere coat, gray scarf, polished shoes, and the gold ring that caught the winter light when he adjusted his glove. He walked toward the rear field with the calm confidence of a man who expected gates to open before he touched them. Officer Blake, he called pleasantly, though no one had told him Nora was there. I heard there was concern about last night's disturbance. I came to offer assistance. Nora's eyes narrowed. This is an active inquiry, Mr. Vale. Garrison stopped at the fence, smile polite. Of course, and as the center's principal donor, I would hate for Cedar Ridge to mishandle sensitive property. Ranger stood. The movement was sudden and silent. Derek took the lead in both hands. Garrison's gaze flicked toward the lockbox. Only for half a second, but Walter heard the change that followed. A breath taken too carefully. Ranger heard it too. The dog stepped in front of Derek, body angled not to attack, but to block the line between Garrison and the box. A low growl began in his chest. Hannah immediately spoke. Ranger, steady. Walter turned toward the dog. Easy. Don't give him your piece. Ranger's growl lowered but did not disappear. Garrison laughed softly. Still unstable, I see. Nora moved between the fence and the field. Interesting word from a man standing outside a restricted scene. Garrison's smile thinned. I only mean that this animal has a documented history. If he is being used to interfere with evidence, there could be liability. Hannah's voice turned cold. He located potential evidence under controlled supervision. Potential evidence of what? Garrison asked. No one answered. Walter tilted his head. You sound worried for a man who came to help. For the first time, Garrison looked directly at Walter. Mr. Harlan, isn't it? I admire your service. Truly. But grief can make people see patterns where none exist. Walter's pale eyes remained unfocused, but his face hardened. I don't see patterns, Mr. Vale. The old man lifted his cane slightly, then set it back into the snow. I hear men hide inside words. Silence settled. Ranger's ears stayed locked forward. Nora closed the lockbox and placed it into an evidence bag. We're done here for now, she said. Everyone back inside. Garrison did not move until Nora stepped away with the box. His eyes followed it. Walter heard the snow compress under the man's shoes. One small shift of weight, a man resisting the urge to reach. Then Garrison smiled again, thanked Marianne for her dedication, and walked back to his SUV as if nothing had touched him. Inside, Ranger did not return to the violent state Derek feared. He was exhausted, trembling, and overstimulated, but he walked back to the restricted wing under his own control. That frightened Hannah in a different way. Trauma without control was dangerous. Trauma with purpose could change a case. Walter remained near the rear door after everyone else moved ahead. Marianne stood with him, both of them listening to Ranger's pause fade down the corridor. Do you think the box was a decoy? She asked. Walter nodded slowly. No, I think it was a breadcrumb. Left by Miles? Maybe. Or left by someone who knew Miles would never get to follow it. Nora approached with the evidence bag sealed under her arm. FM-12 may refer to the old Fairmont feed mill. It belonged to a logistics company before Vale bought the land. I'll check property records before we do anything else. Walter's mouth tightened. Ranger already knows that place. Nora looked at him. How could he? Walter turned his blind face toward the restricted wing. Because when we found that box, he didn't act like the search was over. He acted like he had just remembered the next door. That evening, after Walter was taken home and the field was locked again, Ranger lay at the front of his kennel, with his head on his paws. Derek watched him through the bars longer than usual. You really did remember, he muttered. Ranger's eyes remained open, fixed toward the rear of the building, where the training field slept beneath fresh snow. In the evidence room, the little rusted key sat inside a plastic sleeve beside the waterproof sheet. Under the fluorescent light, Nora noticed something she had missed outside. The key was stamped with two faded letters, barely visible beneath corrosion. FM, the same letters written on the note. She photographed it, sent the image to county records, and looked through the window toward the restricted wing. Ranger had not found the truth. Not yet. But he had found the first lock. And somewhere beyond Cedar Ridge, someone who wore a gold ring with the letter V now knew the dead man's dog was remembering too much. The name Donovan led Officer Nora Blake to the far end of Cedar Ridge, where the road narrowed into a strip of frozen asphalt between pine trees and old stone fences. The house stood alone beneath a white sky, small and weathered, with a sagging porch, pale curtains, and a mailbox half buried in snow. It was the kind of place people passed for years without wondering who lived inside because the windows gave nothing away. Nora parked at the edge of the driveway, engines still ticking in the cold. Marianne Cole sat in the passenger seat, holding the copied inventory sheet from Miles Donovan's storage file. Walter Harlan sat in the back, his dark wooden cane resting across his knees, his old olive coat buttoned up to his throat. He had insisted on coming, not because he thought he could do Nora's job, but because Ranger's reaction to the name Donovan had made something inside him refuse to stay behind. Ranger had not been allowed to come inside town without further clearance, but Dr. Hannah Voss had agreed to bring him later under controlled conditions if Evelyn Donovan consented. Walter understood the caution. He also understood that some doors opened only when grief recognized grief on the other side. Evelyn Donovan did not answer the first knock. Nora knocked again, this time identifying herself. For several seconds, there was nothing but wind scraping dry branches against the siding. Then, a chain slid, a lock turned, and the door opened 3 inches. The woman behind it was nearly 80, small and thin enough that her burgundy cardigan seemed to hang from her shoulders rather than rest on them. Her white hair was pulled into a low knot, wisps loose around a deeply lined face. Her eyes were pale blue, watery and alert, carrying the kind of fear that had learned to sit quietly in the same chair for years. One hand gripped a cream shawl at her chest, the other trembled against the doorframe. "I already told the center," she said before Nora could speak. "I don't want the bag." Marianne stepped forward gently. "Mrs. Donovan, the bag is missing." Evelyn's face changed so quickly. Walter heard it before anyone described it, the small gasp, the pressure of fingers tightening on wood, the silence of someone whose worst secret had just knocked politely. "Missing?" she whispered. Nora showed her badge again. "May we come in?" Inside, the house smelled of old tea, dust, furniture polish, and winter medicine. Photographs covered the mantel. Miles Donovan as a boy with crooked front teeth. Miles in a high school football uniform. Miles in military dress, smiling beside a younger Evelyn. And finally, Miles kneeling beside Ranger. One hand buried in the Belgian Malinois' thick fawn coat. The dog's black masked face turned toward him with absolute trust. Walter could not see the photos, but Marianne described them in a low voice. When she reached the one with Ranger, Walter turned his head slightly. "Was the dog happy?" he asked. Evelyn looked at him for the first time. "He looked like my son was the whole world." Walter nodded. "Then he looked like a working dog who had found his person." Evelyn's mouth trembled. "And they took both from each other." Nora kept her questions careful. She asked about the duffel bag, the field notebook notation, the small rusted key stamped with the letters FM, and the waterproof sheet found under the training platform. Evelyn listened with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had the fragile stillness of a woman who had spent years practicing how not to fall apart in front of strangers. "Miles called me 2 weeks before he died," she said at last. Her voice was thin but clear. "He said if anything happened, I should not trust the first man who came with condolences. I thought he was exhausted. Soldiers say strange things when they've seen too much." Walter's fingers tightened around the cane. "What else did he say?" Evelyn looked toward the mantel. "He said Ranger knew where the rest was." Marianne leaned forward. "The rest of what?" Evelyn closed her eyes. "Proof." The word changed the room. Nora did not move, but her attention sharpened. Evelyn explained that Miles had discovered irregular shipments while attached to a logistics support detail. Medical supplies, field equipment, and relief materials were being moved through false records. Some crates disappeared from official inventory and reappeared under private contractor routes. The name connected to those routes was not always written clearly, but Miles had mentioned one man more than once, Garrison Vale. At the time, Vale was praised publicly as a generous military contractor and veteran sponsor. He donated equipment, funded ceremonies, shook hands with officers, and built a reputation from polished speeches. Miles believed the kindness was a curtain. He said men like that do not steal with dirty hands, Evelyn whispered. They steal with paperwork. Walter's jaw hardened. He had known men like that. Men who never stood near explosions but somehow profited from every echo. Evelyn rose slowly and crossed to the mantel. From behind Miles's framed photograph, she removed a small folded cloth, yellowed with age. She held it as if it were a living thing. "This came in the mail 3 days after he died," she said. "No return address, just this." Nora unfolded it carefully. Inside was a torn piece of training patch from Ranger's old harness and a handwritten line in Miles's blocky script. "If they come for the bag, follow the dog, not the men." Walter's breath caught. On the back of the cloth were 3 faint circles pressed into the fabric, the same pattern Ranger had pawed into the snow at the training field. 3 marks. "Trust me." Evelyn looked at Walter with tears in her pale eyes. "I never understood why my son sent a message to a dog." Walter's voice broke softly. Maybe he knew the dog would remember what people were too afraid to say. Nora photographed the cloth and sealed it in evidence. Marianne wiped at her cheek quickly, embarrassed by her own tears. Evelyn sat down again, suddenly smaller. "After Miles died, a man came here," she continued. "Not right away. A few months later, he said he represented a foundation helping military families. He wore a black coat, a gray scarf, and a gold ring. Nora's pen paused. The letter V? Evelyn nodded. He told me Miles had been confused near the end. He said grief could make families imagine conspiracies. He offered to take Miles's belongings and handle them respectfully. I refused. After that, someone called at night for weeks. No threats at first, just breathing. Then a voice said old women should not keep old wars alive. Marianne's face tightened. Walter heard her anger in the way she shifted in the chair. Why didn't you report it? Evelyn looked down at her trembling hands. Because I was alone. Because my son was dead. Because men with money do not need to shout to make you understand. Outside, tires crunched softly in the driveway. Nora immediately stood and moved toward the window. A small Cedar Ridge Transport SUV pulled up behind the police car. Dr. Hannah Voss stepped out first, ivory coat replaced by a dark winter field jacket, her hair tied back neatly, face focused. Derek Shaw came around the rear with Ranger on a secured long lead. Ranger moved cautiously, his deep fawn mahogany coat bright against the snow, black mask sharp, ears forward. He did not pull. He scanned the porch, the yard, the windows, every line of scent crossing the air. Evelyn saw him through the window and made a sound that was half sob, half prayer. Ranger. The dog stopped at once. His ears shifted. His body changed from working tension into something older and more vulnerable. Hannah looked to Nora for permission. Nora looked to Evelyn. The old woman nodded, hand over her mouth. They did not bring Ranger inside immediately. Hannah kept him on the porch while Evelyn opened the door. For a moment, no one breathed. Ranger stared at Miles's mother, and the old woman stared back at the last living creature who had known her son's final years. Then Ranger lowered his head, not in submission, in recognition. Evelyn stepped forward with shaking knees, and Derek nearly reached to steady her. But Walter spoke first. Let them meet at their own speed. Evelyn stopped just outside the door. Ranger took one slow step, then another. He sniffed the air around her cardigan, the cream shawl, the hands that had once touched Miles's face when he was a boy. A low whine rose from his chest. Evelyn reached down and laid her trembling fingers on the top of his head. Ranger closed his eyes. You still remember him, she whispered. The dog leaned into her hand, and the porch seemed to hold both a mother's grief and a dog's loyalty in the same breath. Evelyn brought out another item, a narrow strip of cloth that had once wrapped part of Miles's gear. Ranger sniffed it and changed instantly. His eyes opened, body stiffening, nose pressing deeper into the fabric. Hannah crouched beside him, watching closely. This scent is different, she said. Not the storage room, not the training field. Ranger inhaled again, then turned his head west, toward the road beyond town. Nora looked at the old key in its evidence sleeve. Fairmont Feed Mill. Evelyn's face went pale. Miles used to go there when he was home on leave, before the company sold the property. He said the old repair room was the quietest place to train Ranger because no one bothered them there. Walter remembered the driver's comment. The road past Vale property, the roof sinking under snow. The breadcrumb had become a trail. Nora did not rush to the mill. She knew procedure mattered, especially with Garrison Vale tied to the land. She called in a request for property records, checked whether the mill was still active, and began preparing grounds for a welfare check based on possible evidence tampering and witness intimidation. Evelyn looked relieved for the first time in the conversation, as if saying the truth aloud had removed one stone from her chest. Walter remained near the doorway while Ranger sat beside Evelyn's chair on the porch, calm but alert. The old blind seal. Listened to them breathe. The mother, the dog, the investigator, the women who had chosen to keep looking. He thought of Caleb Reed's tag in his own pocket and wondered how many dead men had left small instructions for the living, hoping someone would be brave enough to read them. By dusk, Nora had enough to continue the inquiry the next morning. She did not want to move in darkness with an elderly witness, a traumatized K9, and weather turning bad. Evelyn agreed to stay with a neighbor for the night, but only after she packed a small bag. Ranger watched her every movement. He did not growl. He did not pace. He simply sat by the door like a guard assigned by a son who could no longer stand there himself. Marianne promised Evelyn that Cedar Ridge would not let the matter disappear again. Hannah promised nothing emotional. only that she would follow the evidence and the dog's behavior as far as both remained sound. Walter said very little. Before leaving, he touched the doorframe with one hand and said to Evelyn, "Your son trained him well." Evelyn answered, "No, my son loved him well. That was different." That night, the storm thickened. Snow pressed against windows across Cedar Ridge, and wind dragged loose branches along the roads. At 9:46 p.m., Nora received a call from the neighbor who was supposed to host Evelyn. The old woman had never arrived. Nora drove back to the Donovan house with lights cutting through the snow. The front door was unlocked. There were no signs of a struggle in the rooms, but Miles's photograph had been knocked face down on the mantel. On the kitchen table lay the strip of cloth Evelyn had shown Ranger, torn in half. Beside it sat a teacup still warm to the touch. When Hannah arrived with Ranger under emergency authorization, the Belgian Malinois sniffed the torn cloth once, then let out a sound so low and broken that Derek took a step back. Ranger did not look toward the storage center, the training field, or the road home. He faced west, toward the Fairmont feed mill and the Vale property beyond it. Walter, standing in the doorway with snow melting on his old coat, heard the dog's breathing turn from grief into purpose. "She's alive," he said quietly. Nora looked at him. "You can't know that." Walter tightened both hands on his cane as Ranger pulled once toward the storm. "No," the old man said. "But he does." The road to Fairmont feed mill vanished under the storm long before the old building appeared. Snow blew sideways across the windshield of Officer Nora Blake's patrol SUV, turning the headlights into two pale tunnels that seemed to end only a few yards ahead. The emergency authorization had come through fast, not because anyone was ready to accuse Garrison Vale in writing, but because Evelyn Donovan was missing. Her teacup had still been warm, her door had been left unlocked, and the torn strip of Miles Donovan's old cloth had carried a scent. Ranger followed west with absolute certainty. That was enough for a welfare check. It was also enough for Nora to stop pretending this was only about stolen property. Dr. Hannah Voss sat in the front passenger seat, her dark winter field jacket zipped high, notebook tucked against her chest, eyes fixed on Ranger's transport crate in the rear. Derek Shaw sat beside the crate, one hand steady on the latch, his broad body tense beneath his black utility jacket. Walter Harlan sat in the second row, cane across his knees, old olive coat dusted with snow that had melted into dark patches. He was not there to search a dangerous building like a younger man. Nora had made that clear twice. But Ranger had refused to settle until Walter's voice reached him, and in a storm, with an unstable K9 following a scent tied to a missing elderly woman, Hannah had finally said what everyone already knew. Ranger needed a human anchor, and for reasons none of them fully understood, that anchor was Walter. Fairmont feed mill rose out of the snow like something the town had tried to forget. The main building was long and low, with corrugated metal walls stained by rust, broken windows patched with old boards, and a roof sagging under white weight. A faded sign hung crooked above the loading bay, Fairmont Agricultural Supply. Beyond it stood two silos, dark against the storm, and a row of smaller outbuildings half swallowed by weeds and snowdrifts. The place smelled of wet grain, engine oil, rotting wood, and old machinery. Nora parked near the service entrance, but kept the engine running. "Nobody goes wandering," she said, turning in her seat. Her gray-green eyes moved from Derek to Hannah, then to Walter. "Derek handles Ranger," Dr. Voss observes. "Mr. Harlan, you stay behind me and away from unstable flooring. If I say stop, you stop." Walter nodded. "I've spent 70 years learning the difference between courage and stupidity. I'll try not to embarrass myself tonight." Derek let out a short, nervous breath that almost became a laugh. Ranger did not make a sound. Inside the crate, the Belgian Malinois stood rigid, deep fawn mahogany coat tight over lean muscle, black mask pointed toward the mill, amber eyes burning with purpose. He was not panicking. He was working. When Derek opened the crate, Ranger stepped down into the snow and lowered his nose instantly. The storm tore at his ears, but he did not flinch. He moved toward the service door in a straight line, long black lead taut but not wild. Hannah watched his tail, shoulders, and breathing. "He's tracking the cloth scent," she said. "No random scanning." Nora raised her flashlight toward the entrance. The door had been forced open recently, though someone had tried to press it back into place. Inside, darkness waited. Walter stopped at the threshold and listened. The old mill had its own language. Wind slipping through cracked panels, water dripping somewhere far inside, a loose chain tapping metal, and beneath all of it, a faint, uneven scrape. Not footsteps, not machinery, something softer. Ranger heard it too. His ears shifted forward. Walter whispered, "She's in there." Nora looked back. "You hear something?" "No," Walter said. "He does." They entered slowly. The beam of Nora's flashlight swept across sacks of hardened grain, rusted conveyor belts, broken pallets, and a scale platform tilted against the wall. The air was colder inside than outside, as if the building had been storing winter for years. Walter walked behind Nora, cane touching the floor in careful arcs, each tap softer than usual. He hated the smell. Old oil, damp wood, dust. It pulled him backward in time, not to battle, but to the night he lost his sight. A truck overturned in freezing rain, smoke crawling low, metal groaning. A young woman crying for her father while Walter pushed through heat he could not see because his eyes were already burning. He had saved the child, not the father. People called him a hero. He remembered only the hand that slipped from his grip. Ranger suddenly stopped and looked back at him. Derek paused. Hannah whispered, "Walter?" The old man inhaled slowly. "I'm here." Ranger held his gaze for a second, though Walter could not see it, then moved forward again. Near the center of the mill, Ranger stopped at a patch of warped floorboards and began pawing once, twice, 3 times. Derek stiffened. Walter's hand tightened on his cane. 3 again. Not frantic, not random. The same rhythm from the training field, the same strange echo of Caleb Reed's old signal. Nora crouched and brushed snowmelt from the boards. Carved into the wood, barely visible beneath dust and old grain, were 3 shallow circles burned into the surface. Hannah's voice dropped. "This wasn't made tonight." Walter turned his face toward the sound of Ranger's breathing. The dog stood over the marks with his head lowered, trembling as if he had reached a place Miles Donovan had once touched. Nora aimed her light farther across the room and found more marks. 3 circles near a doorway, then 3 more beside an old repair sign. The mill was not just a place Ranger remembered. It had been marked for him long ago. The 3-circle trail led to a side repair room, where the smell of oil and old rubber hung heavy. The door was jammed from the outside with a rusted metal bar, recently wedged into the latch. Nora removed it with Derek's help, then pushed the door open. Evelyn Donovan lay on the floor inside, wrists tied loosely with cloth, her burgundy cardigan dusted with grain, cream shawl twisted around one shoulder. She was conscious but weak, pale blue eyes blinking against the flashlight. "Don't let him take it," she whispered, before anyone could ask if she was hurt. Marianne was not there, but Walter heard her name in the concern that passed silently through the group. Nora knelt beside Evelyn, checked her breathing, and radioed for medical support. Hannah kept Ranger back until Nora confirmed Evelyn could tolerate him close. The moment Evelyn heard Ranger's low whine, tears slipped down her wrinkled face. "He came," she whispered. "Miles always said he would." Ranger lowered himself beside her, pressing his black masked muzzle gently near her hand without touching the bindings, and for a moment the dangerous dog was nothing but a son's last promise, made warm and alive. Evelyn explained in broken pieces while Nora cut the cloth from her wrists. A man had come to her house after dark. She had not seen his face clearly, but she smelled mint tobacco and the same cologne from years before. He had demanded the key Miles sent her, the real one, not the rusted marker from the training field. Evelyn had refused, until he placed Miles's photograph face down and told her some memories could be buried twice. He brought her to the mill, forced her to point out the repair room, then left her there while he searched below the floor. "He didn't find it," Evelyn whispered. "Miles changed the hiding place. He told me once if the floor was ever opened, Ranger would know the second mark." Hannah looked at Ranger. The dog had already risen. He was facing the far wall of the repair room, nose fixed on an old tool cabinet bolted crookedly against the boards. Derek moved with him. Behind the cabinet, half hidden by dust, were 3 circles not burned into the wood, but scratched into the metal itself. Nora photographed the mark, then allowed Derek to pull the cabinet away. Beneath it was a narrow floor hatch with an old padlock. The rusted FM key from the training field fit badly, but it fit. Nora opened the hatch and lifted out a waterproof metal case wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were Miles Donovan's field notebook, photographs, shipping codes, copies of signed manifests, and a small flash drive sealed in plastic. Nora did not read every page there. She did not need to. Garrison Vale's name appeared enough times in the first 3 entries to change the air in the room. Medical supplies diverted, relief crates relabeled, contractor routes altered, witness names circled. Miles had not been confused. He had been building a map. Walter stood near the doorway, hearing paper move under Nora's gloves, and felt something inside him shift. For years, he had believed the dead left only grief behind. Tonight, Miles Donovan had left instructions. A sharp metallic bang echoed from the back of the mill. Ranger spun toward it, growl rising. Nora lifted her flashlight, but the beam caught only swinging chains near a side passage. Then came the smell of smoke. Not heavy at first. Thin, oily, intentional. Hannah's face hardened. "We need to leave now." Derek took Ranger's lead. Nora sealed the evidence case, then helped Evelyn to her feet. The old woman could barely stand. Walter moved aside, cane searching for stable floor, but the smoke reached him before anyone else noticed how badly it had changed him. The smell struck the deepest part of his memory. Freezing rain, burning engine, a trapped hand. The world he could not see then and could not see now collapsed into one dark corridor. His breath shortened. His fingers slipped on the cane. Ranger jerked back toward him immediately. "Walter," Hannah said sharply. "Talk to me." But Walter was no longer fully in the room. He heard Evelyn coughing and Nora calling for the exit. But under that he heard the old accident, the voice of Caleb Reed, the plea of a man he had failed to save, all braided together by smoke. Ranger pressed his body against Walter's legs hard enough to steady him. The dog barked once, short and commanding. Walter flinched. Ranger barked again, then pushed his shoulder into Walter's knee and angled toward the doorway. Not pulling, guiding. Derek loosened the lead instinctively. "He's trying to move him." Hannah's voice was urgent but controlled. "Let him." Walter, hand on the lead. "Follow Ranger's body." Walter's hand found the line. His cane found the floor. Ranger moved one step, then stopped until Walter's boot followed, then another. Nora supported Evelyn ahead of them, while Derek cleared loose boards. Smoke thickened near the ceiling. Somewhere behind them, a small flame crawled up a pile of oily rags and old feed sacks, enough to threaten but not yet consume the room. Step by step, Ranger led Walter through the repair room, around the warped boards, past the burned 3 circle marks, and into the main mill. Each time Walter faltered, Ranger leaned harder against him, using his own body as a rail. Walter's breathing came ragged, but he stayed upright. "I'm with you," he whispered, though no one knew if he spoke to Ranger, Caleb, Miles, or himself. The service entrance had partly jammed from wind and shifting wood. Derek forced it open while Nora guided Evelyn through first. Hannah followed with the evidence case tucked inside her coat. Ranger stopped at the threshold and waited until Walter crossed into the snow. Cold air hit the old man's face, and the present returned all at once. He sank to one knee, one hand buried in Ranger's fur. The Belgian Malinois stood braced beside him, chest heaving, amber eyes still fixed on the mill. Emergency lights appeared far down the road. Nora had called for backup and medical support before entering, and now the storm glowed red and blue through the trees. Evelyn was wrapped in a thermal blanket from Nora's SUV, shaking but alive. The evidence case sat locked in the patrol vehicle. Garrison was gone, but his silence had started to fail. Walter remained kneeling in the snow, ashamed of how close the smoke had come to breaking him. Ranger lowered his head and nudged the pocket of Walter's olive coat, right where Caleb Reed's old tag rested. Walter froze. Then he understood. The dog had chosen to leave the chase and come back for the living. Not the dead, not the proof, not revenge. The living. Walter closed his eyes, his clouded gaze turned toward the storm. "You're right," he whispered. "I've been guarding graves so long I forgot what rescue means." Ranger leaned into him, steady and warm. Behind them, smoke leaked from the old mill into the winter sky. carrying with it the first real proof that Miles Donovan had not died with the truth after all. By morning, the storm had loosened its grip on Cedar Ridge, but the town did not feel calm. Snow still lay heavy on rooftops and fence rails, and the road outside the Fairmont feed mill was marked with tire tracks, boot prints, and the dark stains of water where emergency vehicles had idled through the night. Walter Harlan sat in the back of Officer Nora Blake's patrol SUV, with a wool blanket over his shoulders and Ranger lying across the floorboard at his feet. The Belgian Malinois did not sleep. His deep fawn mahogany body remained tense with exhaustion. His black masked face lifted every few seconds to check Walter's breathing. His amber eyes no longer burned with blind rage, but with something more painful and more human, fear of losing the person he had just chosen to protect. Walter's hand rested on Ranger's head, fingers buried in the thick fur behind the dog's ears. He could feel the tremor still running through him. "I'm here," Walter whispered. "You got me out." Ranger pressed his muzzle against the old man's boot as if the words were not enough, as if proof required touch. Nora stood outside the SUV, speaking with 2 county investigators beside the evidence case. One investigator, Lieutenant Sam Carver, was a compact man in his late 50s with a shaved gray head, a square weathered face, and the calm suspicion of someone who had spent 3 decades listening to people lie badly. He wore a dark winter coat over a plain suit, practical boots, and leather gloves, and he treated every object from Miles Donovan's notebook like it might become the hinge of a door no one powerful wanted opened. Beside him was Deputy Lena Ortiz, a younger deputy around 30, short and sturdy, with warm brown skin, black hair tucked beneath a knit cap, and sharp dark eyes that missed little. Lena photographed the mill entrance, the burned rag pile, the forced repair room latch, and the hatch where the waterproof case had been hidden. She was quiet, efficient, and careful in the way good investigators are careful when a case has finally become bigger than the people who first reported it. Nora did not mention Ranger as proof. She did not need to. The proof was in the notebook, the shipping manifests, the property records, Evelyn Donovan's statement, Eli Brooks's confession about the gate, the torn fabric from the fence, and the old key marked FM. Garrison Vale was arrested 2 counties away that afternoon, not in a dramatic confrontation, but at a private airfield where he had been trying to board a charter flight under the excuse of a business emergency. He wore the same black cashmere coat and gray scarf, though the polished confidence had cracked around his eyes. His gold ring with the engraved V was removed, photographed, and bagged. In his vehicle, investigators found traces of grain dust from the mill, a torn cuff matching the fabric from the Cedar Ridge fence, mint tobacco, and a folder containing copies of old donor access codes. That mattered more than any growl Ranger had ever made. Ranger had led them to truth, but the law needed paper, witnesses, timelines, and evidence that could survive a courtroom. Walter was relieved by that. He did not want the dog treated like a miracle machine. Ranger was not a magic answer. He was a wounded soldier who had remembered a scent, followed training, and refused to abandon the living. At Cedar Ridge, the mood changed slowly, not all at once. The staff did not suddenly rush toward Ranger with open hands. They still gave him space. Derek Shaw still used the long lead. Dr. Hannah Voss still logged every reaction in her notebook, marking stress signals, recovery time, scent triggers, and response to Walter's voice. Marianne Cole still asked twice before opening any gate. But the fear in the building had shifted. It was no longer the old fear that said Ranger was only dangerous. It was the humbled fear that comes when people realize they misunderstood a creature who had been speaking in the only language he had left. Evelyn Donovan was treated for cold exposure and released the next day. She came to Cedar Ridge wrapped in her cream shawl, burgundy cardigan buttoned crookedly, pale blue eyes, wet but clearer than before. When Ranger saw her from behind the safety line, he did not bark. He lowered his head and stepped close enough for Evelyn to touch the top of his skull. "You kept him safe," she whispered. Walter stood beside them, cane in one hand, the other resting lightly against the wall. Evelyn looked toward him. "Miles would have liked you." Walter gave a small, broken laugh. "I'm not sure Miles would have taken orders from an old blind man." Evelyn smiled through tears. "No, but he would have trusted your dog." Later that afternoon, Doctor. Hannah brought out a sealed envelope recovered from the waterproof case. One she had not opened at the mill because it was marked in Miles Donovan's handwriting, for Ranger's next handler. The words struck the room silent. Marianne looked at Walter. Derek stopped breathing for a moment. Evelyn nodded for Hannah to open it. Inside was a single page, old but dry, written years earlier by a young soldier who must have known danger was closing in. Hannah read it aloud, voice steady until the last lines. "If Ranger survives me, do not mistake grief for failure. He will guard what he loves, until someone teaches him he is allowed to live after loss. Do not give him to the strongest man. Give him to the one who knows how to wait." Walter lowered his head. Ranger, hearing the emotion in the room, leaned against his leg without being told. For the first time, no one at Cedar Ridge wondered who Miles had meant. The adoption decision was not made that day, and that made it feel more real. Dr. Hannah refused to let emotion override responsibility. She held a formal review with Marianne, Derek, Nora, Evelyn, and Walter present. Ranger lay behind a half-open safety gate, not restrained by fear but still carefully managed. Hannah explained that Ranger could not be placed in a busy family home, could not be taken into crowded public spaces immediately, and could not be treated like a fully trained guide dog. "He is not cured," she said. "Trauma does not vanish because of one heroic night." Walter nodded. "I know." Hannah looked directly at him. "He will need structure, quiet, continued evaluation, a gradual handling plan. You will need support." At 70, Walter said, support has become harder to reject. Derek spoke next, surprising everyone. "I'll help with the handling plan." He rubbed the scar near his wrist, face serious. "I spent months thinking he was trying to hurt me. Maybe some days he was, but maybe some days I was standing too close to a wound and calling it teeth." Marianne's eyes softened. Nora added that she could arrange welfare check-ins during the first month. Evelyn offered Miles's old training logs. Eli Brooks, standing near the doorway with his worn backpack held in both hands, asked quietly if he could come clean kennels again and donate his stipend toward his mother's bills, honestly this time. Marianne looked at him for a long moment, then said, "You can start by helping Derek repair the rear fence." Walter signed the conditional adoption papers 3 days later. His signature was slow and uneven, guided by Marianne's finger at the line, but when the pen lifted, the room seemed to exhale. Ranger stood beside him, wearing the faded tan tactical K9 vest again, not because he was being sent back to war, but because Hannah believed familiar gear could be reintroduced with calm associations. The vest had been cleaned, the old patches removed, except for one small plain service patch Evelyn had approved. Ranger looked taller in it, but not harder. Walter reached down, found the edge of the vest, and smoothed it once. "You and I are going to be a strange pair," he said. Ranger nudged his hand. "I know," Walter answered, as if the dog had disagreed. Marianne laughed softly. It was the first uncomplicated sound anyone had heard in that hallway for days. Walter's house at Birch Hollow had been quiet for years, in a way that made even sunlight feel hesitant. The porch boards creaked under his boots as he led Ranger inside for the first time. The small living room smelled of wood smoke, old books, wool blankets, and black coffee. Curtains hung closed over the front windows. A single armchair faced an unused fireplace. On the kitchen table sat a framed photograph of Walter's late wife, a small wooden box, and the cloth-wrapped metal tag of Caleb Reed. Ranger entered slowly, nose low, mapping the space by scent. He checked the door, the windows, the hallway, the bedroom, then returned to Walter and sat at his left side. He did not pace. He did not search for an exit. He chose a post. Walter smiled faintly. "Of course," he murmured. "First day home and you're already on duty." He opened the curtains that evening for the first time in months, not because he could see the fading light, but because Ranger could. The weeks that followed were not perfect, and that made them honest. Ranger startled at the sound of delivery trucks. Walter woke from nightmares, smelling smoke that was not there. Some mornings, the old man's knees hurt so badly that Ranger had to wait patiently by the door while Walter cursed under his breath and searched for his cane. Twice, Ranger growled at strangers who came too close too fast. Dr. Hannah adjusted the training plan. Derek visited every Tuesday to work on lead pressure and calm stops. Marianne came with paperwork and left with coffee. Nora stopped by under the excuse of checking the mailbox after storms. Eli repaired the center fence and sent proof of his mother's medical payment to Marianne without being asked. Slowly, the world grew larger. Ranger learned to stop Walter before the porch step, to press his shoulder against the old man's leg near road edges, to guide him around fallen branches, and to lie across the bedroom doorway at night until Walter's breathing deepened. One evening, Evelyn visited with a small package. Inside was Miles Donovan's old K9 patch, cleaned and folded. Walter placed it beside Caleb Reed's metal tag in the wooden box on the kitchen table. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he rested his hand on the box and whispered, "I kept Caleb like a punishment. Miles kept a truth like a promise. Maybe the dead ask different things of us than we think." Evelyn touched his arm. "Maybe they only ask us not to stop living with them." Ranger lay at their feet, head on his paws, eyes half closed, finally still in a room where no bars separated him from warmth. The final ceremony at Cedar Ridge was small. No cameras from news stations, no speeches written for reputation, no donors in polished shoes. Just staff, veterans, handlers, a few families, and dogs sitting beside the people who had not given up on them. Walter stood near the old training field, with his cane in one hand and Ranger at his side. Snow had begun to melt along the fence line. Marianne spoke first, then Dr. Hannah, then Evelyn. When Walter was asked to say something, he touched Ranger's vest and turned his clouded eyes toward the quiet crowd. "I came here looking for a dog to help me find my way around the dark," he said. "But darkness was never only in my eyes. It was in the rooms I stopped entering, the calls I stopped returning, the names I carried like chains." Ranger leaned against him. Walter's voice softened. This dog did not need to be conquered. He needed to be trusted slowly. And I did not need to be rescued by someone strong. I needed to be found by someone who understood. Wanushiv kept standing guard over pain. The crowd remained silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because some endings deserve quiet. That night, back at Birch Hollow, Walter sat on the porch while Ranger lay across his boots, watching the tree line. The world was still cold. The past was still real. Caleb Reed was still gone. Miles Donovan was still gone. But the house behind Walter was no longer empty, and the silence around him no longer felt like punishment. He reached down and touched Ranger's head. "Ready to go in, soldier?" Ranger rose, steady and close, waiting for the cane to tap once before moving. Together, they crossed the porch threshold slowly. An old blind Navy SEAL and the K9 no one thought could be touched. People would later say, Walter saved Ranger. Others would say Ranger saved Walter. But in the quiet truth of that house, neither version was complete. They had simply found the one soul willing to walk back through the dark beside them, and for both of them, that was enough. Sometimes, the miracle we pray for does not arrive with thunder, light, or a voice from the sky. Sometimes God sends it quietly, through a loyal dog, an old man with a broken heart, or a stranger who refuses to give up when everyone else has walked away. Walter and Ranger remind us that pain does not mean a life is over, grief does not mean love has disappeared, and being broken does not mean God has forgotten us. Sometimes, the very wounds we carry become the reason we can understand someone else's suffering. Sometimes the soul that saves us is the one we never expected to meet. In everyday life, we may not always know who around us is fighting a silent battle. A neighbor, a parent, a veteran, a friend, or even someone who seems cold and distant may simply be carrying a pain they never learned how to explain. So be patient, be kind, listen before you judge, and never underestimate the healing power of loyalty, compassion, and faith. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story meant to you. And if you believe in stories about courage, loyalty, faith, and second chances, please subscribe to Navy SEAL and K9 Stories. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your heart through every dark season of life.